To the public, Grand Duke Dmitri was the pinnacle of imperial masculinity. But behind closed palace doors, he was entangled in the intoxicating web of Prince Felix Yusupov, a man famous for his drag balls and decadent lifestyle. They were more than cousins. They were partners in a scandalous, forbidden romance. The assassination of Rasputin wasn't just a political duty, it was a blood pact, the ultimate consummation of their bond. While the traditional Romanov family perished, the queer assassin walked away, saved by the very sin that defined him. Dmitri Pavlovich entered the world in September 1891 at the darkest edge of the year. He was born at the Ilyinsko estate outside Moscow, the son of Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich and Princess Alexandra of Greece. It should have been a time of celebration, but tragedy struck before he could even take his first steps. His mother, barely 21 years old, went into premature labor. She slipped into a coma and died just 6 days after he was born. In the superstitious, omen-obsessed world of the Russian peasantry and the court alike, this was a heavy burden for a child to bear. He was the boy who had cost his mother her life. His father, Grand Duke Paul, was shattered. Grief drove him to a kind of madness and then to a scandalous decision that would sever the family further. He entered into a morganatic marriage with a divorced commoner, a woman the Tsar refused to accept. For this defiance, Paul was exiled from Russia, banished from the presence of the emperor. Dmitri and his elder sister Maria were effectively orphans. They were children of the blood royal, yet they had no parents to hold them. They were alone in a palace full of servants. Fate intervened in the form of their uncle, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, and his wife, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, known to the family as Ella. They took the children in, but this was no ordinary foster home. Sergei was a polarizing figure, the Governor General of Moscow, a hardline reactionary who believed in the absolute, unquestionable power of the autocracy. He was a man of iron discipline, cold and distant, feared by the liberals and hated by the revolutionaries. Ella, by contrast, was a creature of light, a woman of profound, almost mystical piety who would eventually become a nun and a saint. Dmitri grew up stretched between these two poles, the crushing weight of duty and the ethereal call of the spirit. He was raised in the Kremlin, in the heart of Russian power. He learned to wear a uniform before he learned to read. He was taught that the Romanovs were chosen by God to lead, that their authority was sacred, and that the people were children who needed a firm hand. But he also saw the cracks in the marble. In 1905, when Dmitri was just a teenager, the violence of the world shattered his sheltered existence. A terrorist from the Socialist Revolutionary Party threw a bomb at Grand Duke Sergei's carriage just outside the Kremlin gates. The explosion was so powerful it shook the buildings. It obliterated Sergei instantly. Dmitri saw the smoke rising. He saw his Aunt Ella, with a terrifying, unnatural calm, go out into the snow to collect the scattered remains of her husband. For a 14-year-old boy, the explosion shattered more than just glass. It obliterated his sense of safety. He realized the palace walls were not high enough to keep out the anger of the world. He learned that being a Romanov meant you were a target. He learned that the glittering world of balls and parades was a thin veneer over a pit of violence. And perhaps deep down, he learned that if you wanted to survive in Russia, you had to strike first. Yet, on the surface, Dmitri betrayed none of this trauma. As he grew into manhood, he became the perfect specimen of imperial grandeur. By 1912, he was a lieutenant in the Horse Guards, the most prestigious regiment in the army. He was a magnificent horseman, so talented that he was selected to represent Russia at the Stockholm Olympics. Photographs from this era show a young man who looks like a prince from a fairy tale, tall, lean, with deep, soulful eyes and a jawline that could cut glass. He was the darling of St. Petersburg society. Women adored him. Men wanted to be him. The Tsar looked upon him with a special affection, seeing in Dmitri the son he wished he had, strong, healthy, capable, unlike the sickly Tsarevich Alexei, who lived under the constant shadow of hemophilia. But beneath the medals and the polished boots, Dmitri was adrift. He was a lonely young man, haunted by the ghosts of his dead mother and his murdered uncle. He was fluid, impressionable, searching for something to anchor him in a world that felt increasingly unstable. He drank too much champagne. He stayed out too late. He had affairs that meant nothing to him. He was bored by the rigidity of court life, by the endless cycle of meaningless ceremonies. He craved intensity. He craved something real. And then he found Felix. Prince Felix Yusupov was everything Dmitri was not. If Dmitri was the soldier, Felix was the sorcerer. If Dmitri was the day, Felix was the night. The Yusupovs were older than the Romanovs, and in liquid assets far richer. Felix was the sole heir to a fortune that was practically incomprehensible. Palaces filled with Rembrandts, boxes of uncut diamonds, estates that stretched across the horizon. But Felix had no interest in being a soldier or a statesman. He was a creature of the aesthetic underground. Felix was notorious. He was openly effeminate, a provocateur who delighted in shocking the conservative sensibilities of the Russian court. He had studied at Oxford, where he embraced the decadent lifestyle of the English eccentric. He was known to dress in women's clothing, frequenting cabarets and gypsy bars, flirting with both men and women, living in a haze of opium smoke and occultism. He was beautiful in a terrifying androgynous way, pale skin, painted lips, eyes that seemed to see right through you. Dmitri and Felix were cousins, but they became something far more complex. They became the deadly duo of St. Petersburg. In the rigid, hyper-masculine world of the Russian military, Dmitri found an escape in Felix. Felix offered him a world where the rules didn't apply, a world of art, sensation, and danger. Rumors began to swirl almost immediately. The court whispered that their friendship was unnatural, that it went beyond the bonds of cousinhood. They were inseparable. They finished each other's sentences. They shared a dark, cynical sense of humor about the crumbling empire around them. Historians have debated the nature of their relationship for a century. Was it sexual? The evidence is ambiguous, hidden in coded letters and the destroyed diaries of the era. But whether they were lovers in the physical sense matters less than the undeniable fact that they were lovers in the spiritual sense. They were soulmates. Dmitri, the lost orphan, found a guide in Felix. Felix, the fragile aesthete, found a protector in Dmitri. They were two halves of a whole, the sword and the mind, the strength and the cunning. By 1916, however, their games of decadence began to sour. The First World War was bleeding Russia dry. Millions of men were dying in the trenches. The economy was collapsing. Food shortages were rampant in the cities. And at the very top, the rot had set in. The Tsar had left for the front to take personal command of the army. A disastrous decision that left the government in the hands of the Empress Alexandra. And standing behind the Empress, casting a long, dark shadow over the entire nation, was Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin. The name itself sounded like a curse. To the Empress, he was a holy man, a starets, sent by God to save her hemophiliac son. She believed, with the ferocity of a mother protecting her child, that only Rasputin's prayers could stop Alexei's bleeding. But to the rest of Russia, to the nobility, the church, the army, and the peasantry, he was a monster. He was the mad monk, a debauched Siberian peasant who smelled of goat and stale wine, who slept with high-born women, who took bribes, who appointed incompetent ministers, who was seemingly dismantling the Russian Empire from the inside out. Dmitri hated him. He hated him with the cold, precise fury of a Romanov who sees his heritage being defiled. He saw Rasputin not just as a charlatan, but as a cancer. Dmitri was a patriot. He loved Russia. He loved his uncle, the Tsar, and he saw that Rasputin was destroying the Tsar's reputation. Propaganda leaflets showed the Empress as Rasputin's lover, the Tsar as a cuckold puppet. It was humiliating. It was dangerous. Felix Yusupov hated him too, but for different reasons. Felix saw Rasputin as a rival force of nature. Felix believed in his own spiritual superiority. He was offended by Rasputin's crudeness. But more than that, Felix saw an opportunity. He saw a chance to be the savior. The atmosphere in St. Petersburg in the winter of 1916 was apocalyptic. The snow was gray with soot. The bread lines stretched for miles. The talk in the salons was no longer about if the revolution would come, but when. Everyone knew something had to be done. There were whispers of a coup. There were whispers of kidnapping the Empress. But Felix and Dmitri began to whisper about something darker. "We must purify the air," Felix told Dmitri one evening, as they sat in the opulent velvet-draped library of the Yusupov Palace on the Moika Canal. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Felix's eyes were feverish. He spoke of Russia as a sick patient, and Rasputin as the tumor that had to be cut out. Dmitri hesitated. He was a Grand Duke. His hands were meant to hold a saber in battle, not a dagger in the dark. To kill a peasant was nothing. In the eyes of the aristocracy, the life of a mujik was worth little. But Rasputin was not just a peasant. He was our friend, the man the Empress called a saint. To kill him was to strike a blow directly against the family. It was treason. It was a betrayal of the uncle who had been like a father to him. But Felix was relentless. He played on Dmitri's vanity. He played on his patriotism. "If we do not act," Felix argued, "there will be no throne left to defend. We are not killing a man. We are killing the devil." He painted a picture of a future where they would be hailed as heroes, the liberators of Russia. They would walk into the history books as the men who saved the dynasty. Slowly, reluctantly, Dmitri was seduced by the idea. The soldier in him saw it as a tactical necessity. The lost boy in him saw it as a chance to finally do something that mattered, to prove he was more than just a decorative prince. He agreed. They gathered a small circle of conspirators. There was Vladimir Perishkovich, a fiery right-wing politician, known for his hysterical speeches in the Duma. There was Dr. Lazovert, a military doctor who would provide the poison. And there was Lieutenant Sukhotin, a young officer. But the core of the plot, the beating heart of the conspiracy, was always Dmitri and Felix. The plan they hatched was a Gothic nightmare, something ripped from the pages of a cheap melodrama. They would lure Rasputin to the Moika Palace under the pretense of a late-night party. Felix knew Rasputin had a weakness for high society women, and specifically, he was intrigued by Felix's wife, the devastatingly beautiful Princess Irina. Although Irina was in the Crimea and wanted no part of the murder, Felix used her as the bait. He told Rasputin that Irina would be there waiting to meet him. They would bring him to the basement, a room Felix had specially renovated for the occasion. They would furnish it with luxuries, Persian rugs, antique furniture, a roaring fire. They would offer him cakes and Madeira wine laced with potassium cyanide. The poison, Dr. Lazovert assured them, was potent enough to kill an elephant. Rasputin would eat, he would drink, and he would die quietly. They would then wrap the body, drive it to the river, and sink it through a hole in the ice. It would be a clean, silent disappearance. Russia would wake up free. If only it had been that simple. As the date approached, December 29th, 1916, Dmitri felt a growing sense of dread. The reality of what they were about to do began to press down on him. This was not a battlefield. This was a trap. It was dishonorable. It was cold-blooded. Yet, he could not back down. He had given his word to Felix, and in the twisted code of their friendship, loyalty to the co-conspirator outweighed loyalty to the crown. On the afternoon of the murder, Dmitri arrived at the Moika Palace. He was pale, his nerves jangling. He checked his service revolver, a Browning. He checked the car. He tried to act casual, but his heart was hammering against his ribs. He was about to cross a line from which there was no return. He was about to kill the favorite of the Empress. He was about to commit the crime that would define his life. The sun set over St. Petersburg, plunging the city into a freezing, inky darkness. The wind howled off the Neva River. Inside the palace, the gramophone was wound up. The poison was prepared. The trap was set. Dmitri Pavlovich stood in the shadows, waiting for the devil to arrive. He did not know it then, but he was waiting for the end of his life as a prince and the beginning of his life as a survivor. The basement of the Moika Palace had been prepared with the meticulous attention to detail of a stage set. Felix Yusupov had overseen every element of the renovation himself. The low vaulted ceilings were meant to evoke the intimacy of a medieval refectory, yet the furnishings were distinctly aristocratic. Persian rugs covered the stone floor to muffle the sound of footsteps and perhaps the sound of a falling body. Antique chairs were arranged around a table set with crystal glasses and plates of petit four. A fire roared in the granite hearth, casting flickering shadows against the heavy stone walls. To an outsider, it looked like a private retreat for a wealthy prince. To Dmitri Pavlovich, who waited upstairs in the main salon, it felt like a crypt. It was late, past midnight on the 29th of December. The wind outside was howling off the Neva, rattling the window panes of the palace, but inside, the air was thick with a suffocating silence. Dmitri paced the parquet floor of the study, his boots clicking rhythmically. With him were the other conspirators, Vladimir Perishkovich, the bald, bespectacled politician whose hands trembled with a mixture of adrenaline and terror, Dr. Lazovert, the military physician who had laced the cakes with cyanide and now sat pale-faced, regretting his involvement, and Lieutenant Sukhotin, young and grim. They were smoking incessantly, the blue haze of Turkish tobacco filling the room, doing little to mask the smell of their collective fear. They were waiting for the arrival of the Dark One. Downstairs, Felix was alone. He was the bait. He had told Rasputin that his wife, the Grand Duchess Irina, was entertaining guests upstairs, but would join them shortly. In reality, Irina was hundreds of miles away in the Crimea, blissfully unaware that her name was being used to lure a man to his death. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Rasputin would arrive. Felix would charm him, feed him the poisoned cakes and wine, and within minutes the cyanide would stop his heart. The doctor would declare him dead. They would wrap the body, and Dmitri would drive it to the river. At midnight, the sound of a motor car engine cut through the silence of the courtyard. Dmitri froze. He moved to the window, peering through the heavy velvet curtains. He saw the headlights of Felix's car sweep across the snow. The door opened, and two figures emerged. One was slight and elegant, Felix. The other was a towering bearded mass in a heavy fur coat, Grigory Rasputin. The victim had arrived. Dmitri watched as they entered the side door. He felt a sudden cold knot in his stomach. This was no longer a theoretical exercise in patriotism. The man was in the house. The beast was in the trap. Dmitri turned to the others. "He is here," he whispered. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from anxiety to a rigid, paralyzed tension. They strained their ears, listening for the sounds from below, the muffled voices, the clink of glasses, the thud of a body hitting the floor. But there was no thud. Minutes turned into an hour turned into 2. The strain was unbearable. Dmitri kept checking his watch, the ticking of the second hand sounding like a hammer in the quiet room. Occasionally, the sound of laughter drifted up from the basement. Laughter. They were down there, drinking and joking, while the assassins upstairs sweated through their uniforms. What was happening? Dr. Lazavert had assured them that the dose of potassium cyanide in the cakes was enough to kill a dozen men instantly. It was supposed to paralyze the respiratory system, causing a swift, if unpleasant, death. Rasputin should have been dead before he finished his second pastry. Suddenly, the door to the study flew open. Felix burst in, his face devoid of color, his eyes wide with panic. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. "He won't die," Felix hissed, his voice trembling. "The animal won't die. He ate the cakes. He drank the wine. He asked for more. He is sitting there talking about the war, talking about the Empress. He is immune." The conspirators stared at him in horror. To the superstitious Russian mind, this was not just a failure of chemistry. It was a confirmation of their worst fears. Rasputin was not a man. He was the Antichrist. He was protected by the devil himself. Lazavert, the doctor, nearly collapsed. "It is impossible," he stammered. "The cyanide. Perhaps the sugar neutralized it. Perhaps his gastritis." "I don't care about his gastritis," Felix snapped, pacing the room frantically. "He is alive. He wants me to play the guitar for him. He is singing." Dmitri stepped forward, grabbing Felix by the shoulders to steady him. The Grand Duke's military training kicked in. Panic was the enemy now. If they faltered, if Rasputin left that basement alive, they were all dead men. The Empress would find out. The Tsar would execute them for treason. There was no going back. "We have to finish it," Dmitri said, his voice low and hard. "If the poison won't work, we use steel." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his service revolver, a heavy Browning. He pressed it into Felix's hand. The metal was warm from Dmitri's body heat. "Go back down," Dmitri commanded. "Talk to him. Get close and shoot him in the heart. Do not miss." Felix looked at the gun, then at Dmitri. In that exchange, the bond between them was sealed in blood. Felix nodded, took the weapon, and turned back to the door. He descended the stairs like a man walking to the gallows. Dmitri and the others waited. The silence returned heavier than before. They could hear the faint strumming of a guitar from below. Felix was playing Yankee Doodle, a bizarre, jaunty American tune that Rasputin apparently enjoyed. The absurdity of the moment was grotesque. A prince playing folk songs for a peasant he was about to murder. Then a shot rang out. It was loud, cracking through the floorboards like a thunderclap. Then a cry. Then the sound of a heavy body hitting the rug. Dmitri didn't wait. He and Perishkovich drew their own weapons and sprinted down the stairs. They burst into the basement room. The air smelled of gunpowder and stale wine. Rasputin was lying on his back on the white bearskin rug. His eyes were closed. His chest was still. A dark stain was spreading across his blue silk shirt. Felix stood over him, the smoking gun hanging loosely in his hand. He looked dazed. "It is done," he whispered. "He is dead." Dmitri approached the body. He looked down at the man who had brought the Romanov dynasty to its knees. Rasputin looked smaller in death, less formidable. His beard was matted, his hands curled into claws. Dmitri felt a wave of revulsion, but also a profound relief. They had done it. They had saved Russia. Dr. Lazovert checked for a pulse. "He is dead," the doctor confirmed. "The bullet went through the heart." The tension in the room broke. The conspirators began to laugh nervously, clapping each other on the back. They were heroes. They had slain the dragon. They began to plan the next steps. Dmitri would drive the car. They would wrap the body in a heavy curtain. They would weigh it down with chains and dump it in the Neva. Leaving the body on the floor, they went back upstairs to prepare for the disposal. Dmitri put on his heavy military greatcoat. He felt a strange exhilaration. The nightmare was over, but the nightmare had only just begun. About an hour later, Felix felt a strange compulsion to check the body again. He went back down to the basement alone. Dmitri stayed upstairs, organizing the coats and the chains. He heard Felix's footsteps fade away. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed from the depths of the palace. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, a sound that made the hair on Dmitri's arm stand up. "Dmitri! Perishkovich! Help! He is alive! He is escaping!" Dmitri froze for a split second, his mind refusing to process the information. Dead men do not escape. Dead men do not scream. But then came the sound of heavy stumbling footsteps pounding up the stairs. Not the light tread of Felix, but the heavy, lumbering gait of a giant. Dmitri and Perishkovich ran into the hallway. What they saw would haunt them for the rest of their lives. At the top of the stairs stood Grigory Rasputin. He was a vision from hell. His face was a mask of blood. One eye was swollen shut, the other burning with a demonic yellow fire. He was clutching his chest where the bullet had entered, but he was standing. He was roaring. He lunged at Felix, tearing an epaulet from the prince's uniform, whispering in a voice that sounded like grinding stones, "Felix, Felix, I will tell the Empress. I will tell everything." Felix broke free, sobbing with terror, and ran behind Dmitri. Rasputin, seeing the other men, turned and scrambled toward the side door that led to the courtyard. He was moving with a terrifying, unnatural vitality. He kicked the door open and stumbled out into the snow. "Shoot him!" Felix screamed. "Shoot him!" Perishkovich, the politician, was the first to react. He ran after Rasputin, his revolver raised. Dmitri followed, but he hesitated. The sight of the resurrected monk had shaken him to his core. Was this man truly immortal? In the courtyard, the scene was chaotic. The snow was deep and pristine, illuminated by the gas lamps from the street. Rasputin was running toward the iron gates, shouting, "Felix! Felix! I will tell the Empress." If he reached the gate, if he got to the street, the guards would hear him. The plot would be exposed. Perishkovich fired, missed. The bullet chipped the stone wall. He fired again, missed. Rasputin kept running, plowing through the snow like a wounded bear. Perishkovich stopped, steadied his hand, and fired a third time. The bullet hit Rasputin in the back. He stumbled but kept moving. Perishkovich fired a fourth time. This shot hit him in the back of the head. Rasputin fell face forward into the snow. He twitched once, then lay still. Dmitri ran up to the body. Perishkovich was already there, panting, wild-eyed. He kicked the body. Is he dead? Is the beast finally dead? Dmitri looked down. The snow around Rasputin's head was turning a dark crimson red. The steam from the warm blood rose into the freezing air. This time surely it was over, but they took no chances. As they dragged the body back toward the house, Rasputin groaned, a low guttural sound. He was still not dead. In a frenzy of panic and rage, Felix grabbed a rubber truncheon, a dumbbell handle according to some accounts, and began to beat the dying man. He struck him again and again, hysterical, trying to beat the life out of him, trying to destroy the monster that refused to die. Dmitri had to pull him away. "Enough, Felix, enough. We have to move him." The noise of the shots had attracted attention. A policeman standing on duty near the Moika Canal had heard the gunfire. He was walking toward the gate. The conspirators froze. They were standing over a fresh corpse in the middle of the courtyard. Dmitri, ever the officer, took charge. He signaled for the others to drag the body into the shadows. Perishkovich went to the gate to intercept the policeman. He recognized the officer. In a moment of drunken bravado, or perhaps genius, Perishkovich grabbed the policeman by the shoulders and shouted, "I am Vladimir Perishkovich. We have just killed Rasputin. The enemy of Russia is dead." The policeman, stunned and likely fearing the wrath of a powerful politician, saluted and walked away. But the secret was out. The clock was ticking. Dmitri brought his car around, a large, open-top Pursang. They wrapped Rasputin's body in a heavy blue curtain. In their panic, they realized they had forgotten the chains. They had no weights to sink the body. It didn't matter. They had to get rid of it now. They heaved the heavy bundle into the back seat. Dmitri jumped into the driver's seat. Sukhotin and Lazavert climbed in with the body. Felix stayed behind, too shattered to continue. Dmitri revved the engine. He drove out of the palace gates and into the sleeping city. It was nearly 4 a.m. St. Petersburg was a ghost town, frozen under a blanket of ice. The wind bit at Dmitri's face, but he didn't feel the cold. He was driving with a corpse directly behind him. He could almost feel the heat radiating from it. Every bump in the road made the body shift. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Rasputin sit up and grab him by the throat. They headed for the Petrovsky Bridge, which crossed the Neva River to Krestovsky Island. It was a desolate spot, far from the prying eyes of the city center. Dmitri drove fast, the tires skidding on the icy cobblestones. When they reached the bridge, they stopped the car near the railing. Below them, the river was a sheet of black ice, but they knew there was a hole near one of the pylons, kept open by the current. They dragged the body out of the car. It was incredibly heavy, dead weight in the truest sense. They lifted the bundle over the railing. 1, 2, 3. They dropped it. The body hit the water with a splash, but because they had forgotten the weights, the air trapped in the heavy fur coat kept it floating for a moment before the current sucked it under the ice. In their haste, they threw Rasputin's galoshes and coat after him. One of the galoshes missed the hole and landed on the ice, stuck against the bridge piling. A fatal mistake. A breadcrumb left for the police. Dmitri stared down at the black water. It was done. The mad monk was gone. The water of the Neva had taken what the poison and the bullets had struggled to kill. He got back into the car. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. He turned the car around and drove back toward the city center. As he drove, a strange sensation washed over him. He felt light. He felt clean. He believed with the naive certainty of youth that he had just saved the empire. He thought the Tsar would thank him. He thought the people would rejoice. He did not know that by killing Rasputin, he had not saved the monarchy. He had killed it. He had shown the world that the Romanovs were vulnerable, that they could be butchered like cattle. He had removed the lightning rod that absorbed the people's hatred, leaving the Tsar and Empress exposed to the full fury of the coming storm. And he did not know that the investigation had already begun. The policeman who had been sent away had reported the incident to his superiors. Blood had been found on the snow in the Yusupov courtyard. The dog was already barking. Dmitri returned to his own palace on the Nevsky Prospect as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky. He was exhausted, his uniform stained with sweat and soot. He collapsed onto his bed, but sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the yellow eye of Rasputin opening. He heard the scream. He felt the thud of the bullets. The next morning, the city awoke to a rumor that spread like wildfire. Rasputin is dead. The Grand Duke Dmitri and Prince Felix have killed him. Crowds began to gather outside the Yusupov palace, cheering. People knelt in the snow to pray, thanking God for the deliverance. Aristocrats sent flowers. Champagne was opened in the officers' messes. For a brief, shining moment, Dmitri was the hero of Russia. He was the St. George who had slain the dragon. But at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, there was no celebration. There was only a cold, terrifying silence. The Empress Alexandra sat in her room staring at the icon on the wall. She knew our friend was gone, and she knew who had done it. She saw not a hero but a murderer. She saw a nephew who had betrayed his blood, and she wanted his head. The police arrived at Dmitri's palace before noon. They were polite, deferential, terrified of arresting a Grand Duke, but they had their orders from the highest authority. Dmitri was placed under house arrest. The phone lines were cut. The gates were locked. The golden cage had slammed shut. Dmitri sat in his study looking out at the cheering crowds beyond his gates. He lit a cigarette, his hand steady now. He realized with a dawning horror that the game was not over. The murder was the easy part. The punishment was about to begin. And the Tsar, the man Dmitri loved like a father, the man he had killed to protect, was now his judge, jury, and potential executioner. The dawn that broke over St. Petersburg on December 30th, 1916, was gray and listless, a typical winter morning in the dying days of the empire. But the city itself was electric. Rumors had traveled faster than telegrams, leaping from the servants' quarters to the grand salons, from the barracks to the bread lines. "The beast is dead," people whispered. "Dmitri and Felix have killed the Antichrist." By noon, the whispering had turned into a roar. Crowds began to gather outside the Moika Palace and Dmitri's residence, the Belozerski Palace. They were not angry mobs. They were jubilant. They knelt in the snow to pray, crossing themselves and weeping with relief. To the people, Rasputin had been a demon who had bewitched the Tsar and led Russia into a disastrous war. His death felt like the lifting of a curse. In the Orthodox churches across the city, candles were lit before the icons of St. George, the dragon slayer, in honor of the Grand Duke. Inside his palace, however, Dmitri Pavlovich felt less like St. George and more like a prisoner of war. The telephone lines had been cut on the orders of the Empress. Sentries from the secret police stood at the gates, their bayonets fixed, not to protect the Grand Duke, but to keep him in. He paced the long gilded corridors of his home, the silence of the palace standing in stark contrast to the cheering outside. He was 25 years old, a hero to the nation, and he was terrified. The investigation had moved with a speed that the Russian bureaucracy rarely achieved. The police had found the galosh stuck against the bridge piling, a fatal amateurish mistake. They had found the blood stains on the parapet. And 2 days later, divers pulled the body of Grigory Rasputin from the icy grip of the Malaya Nevka River. The condition of the corpse was the stuff of nightmares, fueling the legend that the man was truly immortal. His arms were raised upward, his fingers curled into claws as if he had been trying to push the ice away from above him. The autopsy, conducted in secret, but leaked almost immediately, revealed water in his lungs. The cyanide had failed. The bullets had failed. The beating had failed. Rasputin had been alive when he hit the water. He had drowned in the freezing darkness, fighting to the last second. When this news reached the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, the Empress Alexandra collapsed. Her grief was absolute and terrifying. She did not see a political assassination. She saw the murder of a saint, the only man who could keep her hemophiliac son, the Tsarevich Alexei, alive. To her, Rasputin was not a charlatan. He was a conduit to God. By killing him, Dmitri had not saved the dynasty. He had doomed the heir. Alexandra demanded blood. She wrote hysterical letters to her husband, Tsar Nicholas II, who was at the military headquarters in Mogilev. She demanded that Dmitri and Felix be shot. She demanded a tribunal. She demanded that the full weight of the law be brought down upon her own family. "He has killed our friend," she screamed at her ladies-in-waiting, her face ravaged by tears. "He has killed Russia." Nicholas II returned to the capital a broken man. He was a gentle soul, ill-suited for the ruthlessness of autocracy, and he loved Dmitri. He had practically raised the boy after Grand Duke Paul's exile. He saw Dmitri as a son, but he was also a husband who could not deny his wife's grief, and a Tsar who could not countenance murder within the royal house. The confrontation, when it came, was not a shouting match, but a cold bureaucratic silencing. Nicholas refused to see Dmitri. He refused to read the letters Dmitri sent, begging for forgiveness, explaining that it was done for the love of the Tsar, to save the throne from the scandal Rasputin brought. The Tsar's silence was louder than any verdict. It was the silence of a door closing forever. The Romanov family, however, rallied around the assassins. In a stunning display of unity that came too late to save the empire, the Grand Dukes and Duchesses signed a collective petition begging the Tsar for leniency. They argued that Dmitri had acted out of patriotism, that he had done what the Tsar himself should have done years ago. They pointed to the crowds cheering in the streets. "Do not punish the boy," his grandmother wrote. "He is the hero of the hour." Nicholas II took the petition, read it, and wrote a single sentence in the margin that would seal Dmitri's fate. "No one has the right to kill on my behalf." It was a statement of moral clarity from a man who had overseen a war that killed millions, but could not forgive the murder of one peasant. The irony was lost on him. On the evening of January 2nd, 1917, the verdict was delivered. There would be no trial. A public trial would only air the dirty laundry of the Romanovs and give Dmitri a platform to become a martyr. Instead, the Tsar exercised his autocratic right to punish his family personally. Felix Yusupov was banished to his country estate in Kursk, a slap on the wrist for the richest man in Russia. But for Dmitri, the punishment was designed to break him. He was ordered to the Persian front, Persia. To the aristocratic ear, it sounded like a death sentence. The Russian campaign in Persia, modern-day Iran, was a forgotten theater of the Great War, a brutal, disease-ridden wasteland where Russian troops were fighting the Ottoman Turks in harsh desert and mountain conditions. It was thousands of miles from St. Petersburg, far from the balls, the intrigues, and the comforts of civilization. It was a place where officers went to die of typhus or a Turkish bullet, forgotten by the world. Dmitri was stripped of his position in the Horse Guards. He was forbidden to say goodbye to his family. He was to leave immediately, under armed guard, like a common criminal. The night of his departure was one of the loneliest moments of his life. He packed his trunks in silence. His valet wept openly. The great rooms of his palace, where he had hosted lavish parties just weeks before, now felt like a mausoleum. He looked at his uniform in the mirror, the uniform he had disgraced, and wondered if he would ever wear it again. He felt a profound sense of failure. He had killed the monster, yes, but the beast's death had not brought the salvation he expected. The Empress was still in power, more paranoid and isolated than ever. The Tsar was still weak. The war was still lost. And he, the Golden Prince, was being cast out into the outer darkness. At 2 a.m. on January 6th, a black car waited in the courtyard to take him to the train station. A few loyal friends had gathered to say goodbye, risking the Tsar's wrath. They embraced him, their faces grim. "You will return a hero," they promised him. "When the war is over, the people will bring you back." Dmitri forced a smile, but his eyes were haunted. He knew something they did not. He felt the shifting of the tectonic plates of history. He knew that the Russia he was leaving, the Russia of palaces and sleigh rides and grand dukes, was already dead. He was not just leaving a city, he was leaving an era. He climbed into the train carriage. The blinds were drawn. As the train pulled out of the station, chugging into the frozen night, Dmitri Pavlovich did not look back. He sat alone in the dim light, listening to the rhythm of the wheels on the tracks. Clack, 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 clack. Each revolution took him further away from the center of the world, further away from his destiny. He believed his life was over. He believed he had lost everything. He did not know that the train carrying him to exile was effectively an ark, carrying him away from the flood that was about to drown his entire family. The journey to Persia was a grueling odyssey. It took weeks. The train moved south, through the endless snowfields of Russia, down toward the Caucasus Mountains. The air grew warmer, the landscape starker. Dmitri watched the transformation through the window. He saw the poverty of the villages, the weary faces of the soldiers at the stations. He saw a country on the brink of collapse. When he finally arrived at the headquarters of General Baratov in Kazvin, Persia, he was a ghost of his former self. He was thin, pale, and exhausted. The general, a hardened veteran, received him with a mixture of respect and pity. Dmitri was given a staff position far from the front lines, but the environment was punishment enough. The heat was oppressive. Dysentery and malaria were rampant. The luxury of St. Petersburg seemed like a fever dream. Dmitri threw himself into his work. He tried to be a good soldier. He tried to forget. But letters from home were sporadic and terrifying. The news was bad. Strikes in Petrograd, bread riots, the Duma defying the Tsar, the army disintegrating. Then came March 1917. The telegram arrived at the headquarters like a thunderbolt. Revolution. The Tsar had abdicated. A provisional government had been formed. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for 300 years, had fallen in a matter of days. Dmitri read the telegram in his tent, his hands trembling. Nicholas II, the uncle who had banished him, was no longer emperor of all Russias. He was just Citizen Romanov, a prisoner in his own palace. The irony crashed over Dmitri like a wave. If he had not killed Rasputin, he would have been in Petrograd when the revolution broke out. He would have been at the side of the Tsar. He would have been arrested along with the rest of the family. He would be sitting in the Alexander Palace right now, awaiting the judgment of the mob. Instead, he was in Persia. He was safe. The Bolsheviks, who were rapidly gaining power in the chaos, had no reach here yet. The British forces in the region were allies. The punishment that Nicholas had devised to shame him, exile, had placed him in the one spot on the map where the Red Terror could not touch him. But safety brought a new kind of torture, survivor's guilt. As the months dragged on into 1918, the news from Russia turned from bad to horrific. The Bolsheviks seized power in October. The Civil War began. The Red Army was hunting down the aristocracy like game. Dmitri sat in his tent in the desert, helpless, as the reports trickled in. He heard about the arrest of his father, Grand Duke Paul. He heard about the imprisonment of his Aunt Ella, the saintly woman who had raised him. He heard about the transfer of the Tsar and his family to Ekaterinburg, to the House of Special Purpose. He wanted to go back. He wanted to fight. He begged the British commanders to let him join the White Army, the anti-Bolshevik forces rallying in the south. But his health was failing. The tuberculosis that would eventually kill him was already taking root in his lungs. And practically, there was nothing he could do. He was one man against a tidal wave of history. Then came the summer of 1918, the season of blood. In July, the news reached Persia. The Tsar, the Empress, the 4 Grand Duchesses, and the Tsarevich Alexei had been executed in a cellar in Ekaterinburg, shot, bayoneted, and dissolved in acid. A day later, another report. Grand Duchess Ella and 5 other Romanov cousins had been thrown alive down a mine shaft in Alapayevsk. The Bolsheviks had dropped grenades onto them and listened to them singing hymns as they died in the darkness. Dmitri collapsed. He fell into a deep depression. The world he knew had been erased. Everyone he loved, his surrogate parents, his cousins, his friends, was dead. They had been butchered while he sat under the stars in Persia, protected by the very sentence of exile they had imposed upon him. Why him? Why was he spared? Was it divine providence, or was it the devil's joke? He realized then the full crushing weight of the paradox. He was alive because he was a murderer. If he had been a good nephew, if he had refused Felix's plot, if he had stayed loyal and clean, his body would be rotting in a mine shaft in Siberia right now. His crime was his shield. His sin was his salvation. The British legation in Tehran realized that Dmitri was a target. Even in Persia, Bolshevik agents were beginning to circle. They offered him a way out. They would smuggle him to India, and from there to London. He had to leave Russia behind forever. The Persian front became his Noah's Ark. Because he was a criminal, he was exiled to safety. Because the others were saints, they stayed behind to be butchered. Dmitri escaped to the west, a man out of time. He drifted to Paris, the city of light and amnesia. There, he met Gabrielle Coco Chanel. She was the ruthless future. He was the tragic past. Their affair was volatile but left a permanent mark on history. Dmitri introduced Chanel to the scent of the Russian court, a formula that became Chanel number. Woo. The bottle itself was modeled after Dmitri's vodka flask. Today, every bottle of the world's most famous perfume contains a ghost of the Romanovs. But even Chanel could not drown out the sound of Yankee Doodle playing in his head. Dmitri drifted through a hollow marriage, a high-profile lawsuit against Hollywood for defaming his conspirators, and endless bottles of champagne. He was the man who survived, and survival, he learned, is not a victory. It is a burden. On March 5, 1942, as another world war raged, Dmitri died in a quiet Swiss clinic. He was 50 but looked 70. "It should always be snowing," he whispered and slipped away. He took his secrets to the grave, but modern forensics would not let him rest. Analysis of the bullet wounds revealed a chilling detail. Rasputin was finished off by a shot to the forehead at point-blank range from a British Webley revolver. This evidence points to Oswald Rayner, a British intelligence officer and friend of Felix. If true, Dmitri's tragedy reaches Shakespearean proportions. He was not just a patriot, he was the fall guy for a British operation. He accepted the stain of murder to protect an ally that later shunned him. We are left with a split screen: the war criminal who drove a corpse through the night, and the survivor who gave the world Chanel No. 5. Dmitri Pavlovich tried to save his country by doing the wrong thing. He failed to save the throne, but he won the only game that matters in a revolution. He died in his own bed.